But with the ascent of Charles V and the wars recommencing between France and Spain, it looks very possible that either France could lose territory, or on the back of this alliance, England could gain the throne of France, plausibly through the Habsburg Alliance. In fact, the Habsburg Alliance was so strong that in 1522, Henry's daughter and heir at the age of 6, Mary, was contracted to marry Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who would have then been in his early 20s. So again, had that marriage contract maintained, and had that been preserved, it's very interesting to think of in terms of the overall implications for the dynasty. But moving on, we have a couple of significant events here. So this is, to my mind, one of the first turning points we have in terms of alternative history of how England could have diverted from Catholicism, which was the Battle of Pavilla. Henry doesn't aid Charles in the Battle of Pavilla. He sits out on campaigning season in the year 1525. And in that time, Charles V wins a great and decisive victory and captures the King of France himself. On the one hand,
we should
Henry,
say the Battle of Pavia is sort of during the Italian Wars, right?
yeah,
It's sort of the main battle of the Italian Wars, or one of them at least.
Yeah, Pavia is just southwest of Milan in Lombardy, and it's part of an ongoing series about the conquest of northern Italy through the acquisition of the Duchy of Milan. But nevertheless, this is a key moment in the history of England also, because Charles V essentially begins a sort of about turn in his foreign policy. He releases Francis, believing that Francis could potentially be turned against, turned towards Habsburg Austria, and accept an alliance, and even accept the loss of some territories in Burgundy in return for his freedom. And as a result, the English alliance looks far more sort of dispensable for Charles V. And this is a great strategic mistake by Charles V. Charles V doesn't gain any territory from this in Burgundy. And later on, we have the contrivance of the League of Cognac and the events leading up to the sack of Rome. But this, I believe, is significant because had Charles V decided, say, for example, to keep Francis locked up, had Charles V decided to compel Francis to renounce his throne, who would the throne been given to? The throne would have been given to Henry VIII as an ally of Charles V. And again, the implications here, had England been able to establish a dual monarchy over England and France, all of a sudden now the idea of switching and turning away from Rome has severe implications in terms of not only breaking the alliance, but in terms of inviting all manner of revolts all across your kingdoms if you're trying to establish a new kingdom in a hostile territory, whilst at the same time you're trying to convert that nation at the same time.
Yeah, it would just add trouble, wouldn't it? But I mean, with regards to Charles, handing over France to England, I mean, I understand that, suppose they were allied, but even then, I mean, surely Charles would have concerns about, what this would do to, I suppose you could call it the balance of power, right? I mean, if England suddenly came into possession of the Kingdom of France as well, I mean, isn't that quite an intimidating prospect for the Spaniards?
In the sense that France would have been a centralized power, yes. In the sense that Henry VIII could have actually utilized that power, no. Henry VIII, as we saw with Henry V, Henry V and the Duke of Bedford, after he died, spent decades trying to subjugate the various nobles in France and indeed the court of the Dauphin in Bourges, and they were never able to do so. So the likelihood is Henry VIII would have been placed as a titular king of France while Francis was locked up. In the meantime, there would have been many revolts in France to, release the king, release Francis, and restore him to the throne, or restore another member of the House of Valois. So France is descending into anarchy and civil war, and Henry VIII is ultimately responsible for it. All the while, Charles V is picking up the courts of France and taking territories from it. So if anything, it suits his interests quite a lot, because he's taken away a powerful, hostile nation, and he's basically created political anarchy in its place. I don't imagine there would be any scenario in which Henry VIII, unless again he was a monarch of Herculean quality, would have been able to wrestle France and been able to turn it into an asset for the Tudor monarchy,
Yeah.
because we only have history to look at, the history of the Lancasterian monarchy and their failure to consolidate their rule over France.
I mean, I suppose again this might be a silly question, but the idea of sort of how would you say, as opposed to a military conquest on the lines of Henry V, if the title was simply handed smoothly to Henry, then perhaps you wouldn't have had such an anarchic response. But I'm not sure.
Yes, and then there are other implications here, because now we bring up the succession again. So the succession obviously would pass to Mary in this situation. Let's assume, Catherine doesn't die of natural causes and, remains wedded to Henry VIII for the rest of her life, and therefore there is no other heir.
Yeah,
And
she's illegitimate. Yeah.
yeah. Well, there are interesting implications for England, but going with our scenario of France, there are interesting implications for France as well, because France had Salic law. So even if Henry VIII were temporarily given the throne of France, unless he completely sort of rebuked and changed the succession law, he would have another struggle in terms of being able to place Mary on the throne of France, given France has that unique propensity in terms of European history to revile any notion of having a female head of state, when most of its neighbors have had female head of states. So again, it's interesting to consider, but I think, putting the France angle to a side just for a moment, this is where we bring in Charles V again, because let's say, for example, push this forward to 1530. Henry VIII officiates over the marriage of Charles V and Mary. The question is now, do they produce an heir? And will that heir, turn England into being a Habsburg nation? And, is Mary even capable of having children? This is an interesting question, because when she does become queen, she, of course, isn't able to have children. She has a series of phantom pregnancies. Columba and I were discussing this before going live. Was this because of, cancer? Was this because of a psychological desire, hysteria-induced pregnancy symptoms, etc., etc.? However, when we look at her in early life, she's under a lot of stress. She has been dispossessed, and as a result, there have always been dispersions cast over her fertility. But again, it's possible to consider that were her situation that much stronger, were she to marry Charles V, who she was pretty obsessed with, it should be also noted, and it was also her cousin, it should also be noted at the same time. She would have been much happier, to say the least, as she was ecstatic in her marriage to Philip II, regardless of how ruinous that marriage was. So had she produced an heir, it's possible Henry VIII could have decided, oh, if I want a male heir, I can simply bypass Mary and I can give it to my male grandson. Kind of like what we see with Jane Grey in the original sort of device for the succession, when we see Edward VI going about and saying, okay, I need to find a male heir, but yet all of my immediate relatives are female. So instead, I'm just going to leave it to a sort of undisclosed offspring of one of these women. And so it becomes, Lady Jane Grey and her heir's male. And then, of course, that never happens. So it just becomes Lady Jane Grey. So that's one sort of possibility. And if that were the case, then all of a sudden the succession issue is no longer an issue. England has happily gained from a Catholic alliance with the Habsburgs and has everything to lose by deciding to invoke the supremacy and break relations with Rome. I mean, the only thing that
in that situation, what would happen? Assuming that England takes France, right, and then there's the marriage alliance between Mary, who I suppose would be the descendant, right, the heir to Henry. She marries the Spaniards. Does that mean that the Spaniards now have a hand in France as well, and that they are the children? Yeah, I mean that's
this is why I push back slightly about your suggestion that the Habsburgs would balk a bit about the idea of Henry VIII becoming King of France, because when
because when
Henry VIII dies, France and England become Habsburg possessions, yes, it's going to be through a different line of the Habsburgs. And, you know, by my count, after 1547, there would be an English branch, an Austrian branch, and a Spanish branch of the
Oh,
House of
that would
Habsburgs.
have been so based.
But it's interesting to consider. And so this is, to me, the sort of first great plausible scenario of England having no real investment in the Reformation conflict, which is the successful alliance between Charles V and Henry VIII, and a successful union between Emperor Charles V and Mary that would have produced a Catholic Habsburg heir to potentially the thrones of England and France. You know, whether England would have been able to hold on to France and France would have slipped back to the House of Valois is another consideration. But it's really just getting to the point where this union is possible, where the alliance has borne fruit, and where Henry VIII doesn't feel that, actually, no, it's not in my interest anymore, so I can just repudiate the match, which is what he ends up doing. So that's scenario one. And, you know, the implications in terms of world history for that happening are, you know, almost too numerous to consider in terms of, you know, a Anglo sort of French Union alliance with Spain and Austria. It's possible that with that combined power and a more bellicose Charles V, that the Protestant Reformation in Germany could be crushed. And that, if anything, I mean, we talk about colonialism. England and France had, you know, will begin their cursory sort of missions in the latter part of the 16th century. But again, it's possible that the Spanish would be more than willing to allow England and France to continue exploring in areas which they don't have a direct investment in claim to. So we're talking about sort of twin powers aligned together in kind of the same way that we see Austria.
Would England have signed off on the what was it, the Treaty of Tordesillas? How do you think that would? Am I getting that right? That's the one where Portugal and Spain sort of divvied everything up, right?
Yeah, but at that time, the whole sort of knowledge of North America, there was very little knowledge of North America at that time. I mean, this was mainly focused on, you know, I mean, even looking at Brazil, I mean, the map at Tordesillas just has a massive empty space.
Wasn't it just based on sort of like latitude, right? You know,
yes,
just everything past this point is yours. Yeah.
Yes, it basically gave a tiny speck of Portugal and the entirety of the east to Portugal, and gave all of the new Americas, save for Brazil, to Spain. But of course, you know, all of these things can be open to revision. So yeah, I think that's interesting. Scenario one, the Habsburg triarchy between Spain, Austria, and England, France, and England, of course, obviously remaining Catholic in that situation.